It is Thursday, November 30th, 2017, and this is Seahawks Chats with Kenneth Arthur, but you can call it 3000 NFL Mock Draft with an emphasis on the Seahawks, more so than the draft today, because my guest is Rob Staton, and we are going to be talking about the Seattle Seahawks for the most part, and we will also be getting into some of how they'll move forward in terms of the draft and what to look ahead to in the 2018 NFL Draft, because we just love to do that. So why wouldn't we get into it now, since we haven't been together in, nigh on a month or so since myself and Rob sat down and talked about football. So that's what we're going to do right now. As the Seahawks stand at 7-4, going into Sunday Night Football against the Philadelphia Eagles this Sunday night at 5:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, which is, I'm going to say, about 1 a.m. where Rob is. Rob, is that how you have to watch these primetime games at 1 a.m., and will you be up for this one?
Yeah, that's true. It'll be 1 o'clock in the morning, about 1:30. What I'm actually going to be doing this weekend is we actually did a podcast once, Kenny, from Disneyland in Paris a couple of years ago, and I'm actually going to be heading over there again this weekend. So I'll be watching the game against Philadelphia from a hotel in a place in England called Kent, and in the same room as my 4-year-old, my 9-month-old, and my wife, who will all be asleep, and I'll be kind of sat in the corridor of the hotel room watching the game on my computer. So if that paints a nice little picture for you of what's going to be happening this weekend for me, I'll be up at 1 o'clock in the morning watching the Seahawks play the Eagles in a hotel room corridor.
Well, let's hope that Seattle is the happiest place on earth this Sunday, and you'll be happy to know that there's a Kent in Washington that a lot of people live in. So
hopefully it's a sign.
Hopefully it is. We'll make that work. And speaking of signs, the Seahawks, all signs were pointing towards disaster as they lost 2 of 3 games because of a number of factors. That there's obviously going to be an emphasis on Blair Walsh's inability to make either a kick beyond 50 yards or any normal kick against the Washington team that they failed to beat at home 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago or a month ago, whatever. As they're going to be at home against the Philadelphia Eagles, where they've lost their last 2 games, and the one before that they needed a furious comeback to beat the Houston Texans at home. The Bleeding Green Nation blog, they sent me their 5 questions this week, and they asked about what's going on at home. And it was really the first time that I had sat down and really dissected perhaps the question, is there something wrong at home? And I mean, I think that trying to lean into my logical side, which I tend to try and do as much as possible. Of course, we let our emotions and our biases get in there too. I just can't see that there's anything going on at home. And we're looking at a coincidence, if anything, where there's just been a couple of losses in a row at a place where they don't typically tend to lose. And everything else about Seattle's home field advantage, nothing has changed as far as I know, unless they've moved CenturyLink into, Idaho or Southern Oregon and they moved it inch by inch, day by day to the point where nobody could notice. Unless that's happened, this is the same field, the same crowd that's going to be on Seattle's side, everything like that, the same weather. So I don't know if there's anything going on at home. I think that it just maybe more of a coincidence on one hand, and the other hand being that the Seahawks aren't as good of a team as they have been in the last 5 years. I think they're maybe better than they were last year, but maybe not up to that same level. So with the Seahawks playing at home this week, and talking about those last couple of losses, Rob, do you see any sort of factor going on to the home field advantage of the Seahawks? How much of a factor do you think that would play in your, we'll get to it eventually, but in your pick this weekend, how much of an advantage do you give at CenturyLink, or is it not as much?
I think all it is that Seattle's margin of error is a lot smaller at the moment, and that's because of the injuries. It's because they can't run the ball effectively. And in previous years, if they stack up 100 yards of penalties, for example, they could probably get by with it because the team was incredibly balanced. They could run the ball. They had very deep defense, in secondary and up front. And teams, even with Seattle conceding a ton of penalties, and even with Seattle having a slow start, teams still couldn't beat the Seahawks. And what you've seen this year is because the team has regressed in terms of their running game, it's completely fallen away and disappeared to the point where I've even forgotten what a good running performance or a 100-yard rushing performance by a running back looks like. And because they are consistently, I think San Francisco was the first game in a long time they didn't give. I think they broke a streak of something like 6 games having given up 100 yards of penalties. Because that's happening, it's making it increasingly harder for the Seahawks to win. So you talk about the 2 games there, Atlanta. A horrendous number of penalties in that game. The Seahawks made mistakes early on. The first kickoff is returned, bad coverage there. Short field, Atlanta score. Then Russell Wilson with a terrible interception. Then the Seahawks missed their own interception in the red zone. Atlanta score. It's 14-zip. The Seahawks drag themselves back with a touchdown and then immediately get the ball back, and then Russell Wilson fumbles for a touchdown. So they spotted the Falcons, 14 to 21 points early in the game, and then lost the game by 3 points. That's the difference, the margin of error there, working against the Seahawks. And then when you go to the Redskins game, a game that I attended, again, just couldn't get out of their own way. The penalties, bringing back a number of big plays downfield in the passing game, a number of holding calls, stuff like that, which really sort of made a game that should have been well within their grasp and their control. A distant one of them, and Blair Walsh missing 3 kicks as well. Again, they couldn't get over that because they just haven't got that cooking on all cylinders kind of situation there. So definitely Seattle's margin of error is smaller, but they have to start playing clean football. And the only way they're going to beat the Eagles in this game is if they're not giving 100 yards of points, that they're not turning the ball over, they're not giving the Eagles cheap scores. They have to play as clean as possible game of football to make up for the fact that they are banged up on defense and they don't have a running game.
Yeah, and this last weekend, they beat the San Francisco 49ers more convincingly than they did at home. Speaking of which, they go to San Francisco and they beat them 24-13. Really, you could call it 24-6. But basically, no big, huge issues there for the defense, even without Richard Sherman and Cam Chancellor being able to shut down a CJ Beathard-led offense. And, coming away with a convincing win that reminds people that Seattle is still a talented football team. I think they've still, even without Sherman and Chancellor, they still have, up there with any team in the NFL, I think top 5, if you just went individually, how many great players are on this team, which is something that you can forget when you lose a couple games by a field goal, just because they're losses instead of wins, So with that being said, the last week's game against San Francisco and not having those 2 guys out there, Richard Sherman for the first time since 2010, and, to not have both of him and Chancellor out there. How did you feel about Bradley McDougald? How did you feel about the cornerback play? Were you encouraged by what you saw from the secondary and just the overall general pass defense without those 2 guys?
I find it very hard to sort of take any great satisfaction from seeing them shut down the 49ers mostly. Just because CJ Beathard is a rookie, you only had to listen to the players speaking after the game, the likes of Michael Bennett saying, they didn't really have a quarterback back there. And I thought Beathard played quite well, but at the same time, he is what he is. A late round rookie who is not going to be the long-term starter in San Francisco. That's going to be Jimmy Garoppolo. And when the likes of Maxwell and Lane and McDougald, for example, were challenged against Atlanta, there was almost like there were certain drives with just a feeling of helplessness, like they just couldn't stop Matt Ryan. There were some big 3rd down plays where you were just sort of fearing that the play was going to be extended. In the past, listen, Seattle have had issue getting off the field on 3rd and long, for example, in the past, but you never kind of really dreaded a 3rd down, like you were expecting a team to convert. You'd almost sort of expect the Seahawks to make the stop and then they wouldn't, and then you'd be frustrated. Whereas when I was watching the Atlanta game, I was kind of feeling like, 3rd and 8, how are they going to convert this? And then it would be converted with a simple slant inside, or they would take on Jeremy Lane and it'd be converted, and that would be a frustration. So I think that the plays they gave up against Atlanta were more concerning than perhaps the successes they had against San Francisco. And to feel comfortable with that secondary, I think this is a big game now against Carson Wentz having a fantastic season. Philadelphia have a lot of weapons. Alshon Jeffrey, who I think he missed practice yesterday, actually competed in practice today, so it looks as if he's going to be okay. They are relatively healthy on offense. They've got a good running game. I think this is going to be a real test for this secondary, and they're just going to have to try and stick. And I think one of the other problems, Kenny, that they've got is that the Seahawks are built to stop the run first and foremost, and with that comes a reduction really in their pass rushing threat. I think the Seahawks are in the bottom 5, bottom 6 for actually pressures in the season in the NFL, and that's not so much because of the talent, because they've got Michael Bennett, they've got Frank Clark, they've got Sheldon Richardson, they've got Naz Jones, they've got players who can create pressure. It's just that they are so intrinsically kind of focused on taking away the running game and then forcing the other team to throw, and they're not going to shift from that now. Not this late in the season. They have to go with the scheme that they've got. That it's harder for the Seahawks than maybe some other teams to kind of flip it and go, okay, we're going to be a pass rush team now. We're going to really pressure and we're going to take the pressure off our secondary. It's not going to work like that. The D-line is going to carry on playing the way the D-line does, and it's going to be up to those defensive backs to make some plays, and that is going to be a real challenge for the likes of Griffin and Lane and Maxwell, unfortunately. So hopefully they can get a nice confidence boost, and if the Seahawks do win this game and they do limit Wentz somewhat, then maybe they can take something from that.
Yeah, speaking of Philadelphia, this weekend it's the Seahawks' first chance to face Carson Wentz this year. They played them last year, but it's their first chance to play the Eagles at a time when the Eagles are flying high, no pun intended, at 10-1. And Carson Wentz, some people call him the MVP leader. I think, we can get into that at some point, but, 28 touchdowns, 5 interceptions. But, when you compare him and Jared Goff, because next week, everybody will get the Wentz versus Goff game. A couple weeks after this, the Seahawks will be playing the Rams for the second time this year, so it'll be their second chance playing Jared Goff. And both guys, maybe right now Wentz is 1 or 2 in the MVP talks. Then maybe Jared Goff is in the 10 to 15 range, just based on stats and everything and the way that the Rams are playing. Just curious now, because the Seahawks will be playing these quarterbacks in 2 of the next 3 weeks. How do you feel? And because we're a draft podcast, how do you feel about Wentz and Goff right now? Do you have a preference which one you would have or the other? And, and how much, who is the most likely, to continue this success after this season between Wentz and Goff?
Wentz completely for me. I think that one of the things you notice when you watch the Rams is that I think Sean McVay is doing a very good job of making life as easy as possible for Jared Goff, and by that I mean there are lots of short throws, lots of get the ball out quickly, get it to a very simple option there, and the way that they kind of scheme is getting guys open, and I think McVay is doing a fantastic job of taking the pressure off Jared Goff. But then when you actually watch the Rams, and I watched them play Seattle, and he had there's loads of turnovers in that game, and he just basically threw into a region on a number of occasions, and there could have been even more interceptions in that game. And then you watch the way he played against Minnesota recently, and he just really did not look good. And even in the Saints game, there were a few plays. I know that they beat the Saints last week, and Goff generally got some quite good reviews from that. I mean, I saw a lot of that game, and was not overly impressed with Jared Goff. And I think what we will find over time, and it may be that this happens next season rather than in the back end of this year, is that teams will look at what the Seahawks did and what the Vikings did and find a way to take away some of these easier plays that McVay is scheming for Jared Goff at the moment. So it's going to be up to Jared Goff to take the next step. And I'm just not convinced that he's capable of that. I'm just not convinced by him at all. But, that's not to say he's having a horrible season. He's doing better than I think many of us expected. But I just, in terms of potential, who would you rather have? It's got to be Carson Wentz. He has taken a genuine next step. He's throwing the ball all over the field. He is extending plays. He's leading that team. You just watch the Eagles, and you can't help but be impressed with the way that he's developed. And he's looking like a star. And I was at the Eagles game last year. You could already see there, just the way that he played. He had the feeling, the presence, and the way that he performed in that game of a future star. And you kind of saw it as Russell Wilson developed, and you kind of see it with Carson Wentz. So I think he's going to be a very, very good quarterback for a number of years. And, for me, between the two of them, it would be a no-brainer. It would be Carson Wentz.
And speaking of great quarterbacks and quarterbacks that are able to do it for the long haul, we can get back to Russell Wilson and the Seahawks, of course. Russell Wilson, if the Seahawks are going to make the playoffs and if they are going to win the division for sure, they need to have a successful December, of course. And that's going to be 5 December games starting on Sunday. They'll have 5 games in December. Well, Russell Wilson's best month has been December historically. In 22 games, the Seahawks are 17-5 with Wilson, which is the most wins they have in any month, and that's with fewer games than he has played in October and November. That's the highest winning percentage of his career. They're 17-5. He's got the most passing touchdowns at 43. His passer rating of 103 is the highest of any month, and I think he is the NFL's best statistically December quarterback in passer rating. His yards per attempt is 8.26 for December compared to 7.01 for September. And he's got 7 rushing touchdowns, which is almost as many as he has in the first 3 months of the season combined. Historically over the course of his career, which he has 9 in September through November and 7 in December. So we're looking at a situation now where Russell Wilson, if he can become the Russell Wilson and be the Russell Wilson that we're used to seeing in December, the Seahawks could easily go 4-1 or 5-0. But if it's one of these situations, especially with the Seattle Seahawks having a very difficult December schedule that includes the Jaguars, the Eagles, the Rams at Dallas, then certainly it's going to take the most Herculean effort on Russell Wilson's part and ability and everything that he can do. So with that being said, and knowing that Wilson, is leading the team in rushing and having to do a lot more this year, he's going to perhaps lead the NFL in pass attempts, which is crazy to think about. But even though I assumed that it would happen at some point, it seems like this is a little bit quicker than expected. So with that being said, and even going up against the Eagles and the Jaguars and the Rams, very tough pass defenses, very tough defenses in general. What are you looking at right now with Russell Wilson, the player that you've seen in the last, few weeks since the last time we talked or whatever? If you've had any thoughts on the season that he's having and what kind of season do you expect him to have from here on out? Can they do enough with Russell Wilson to, get the wins they need to get to the playoffs again?
Well, I have a quick thought first on the whole December thing, and look, he's obviously had a very good run there, and there's no disputing that. But I have got a couple of thoughts on that. The first one is that he's also had some of the most disappointing losses in his career in December. So, like last year, for example, they lost to the Cardinals on Christmas Eve. That cost them the number 2 seed, and that was a really poor performance by everybody. It took one of those dramatic late comebacks, and they still couldn't win the game. If the Seahawks win the number 2 seed last year, get a bye, and then get to play the Falcons in Seattle as opposed to having to go to the Georgia Dome, then if the Seahawks had won that game, they would have hosted the NFC Championship against the Packers. Doesn't mean that they would have won either of those games or gone to the Super Bowl or beaten the Patriots in a rematch, but that Arizona game might be the second most disappointing loss. Of course, there's one that stands out more than that. The second most disappointing loss of the sort of Russell Wilson era. And then when you go back over the years, they lost to the Rams in December the year before, which at home, which was a very disappointing loss and avoidable. Again, the bad weather situation. Even in 2013, they had that horrible loss to the Cardinals. Was it might have been Christmas Eve again? Maybe in the 23rd, they lost to the Cardinals at home in 2013. They've had some big wins as well, of course, and I just think that maybe that whole December, for example, last year the statistic was that Russell Wilson's got the best November record in the NFL, and then they went 1-2. And the other thing that I kind of have a thought on this is that there is kind of this narrative, the Seahawks always leave their best football for the end. It's almost because they have to. There's the teams like Patriots, for example, playing this terrible AFC East. And when they get to December, they've nearly always tied up a number 1 or number 2 seed. They've certainly won the division by that point. And they maybe take the foot off the gas a little bit, preparing for the playoffs. Whereas the Seahawks always tend to sort of give themselves a lot to do in these final 2 months, whether that's to get into the playoffs or to try and get a preferable seeding. If even in 2014, for example, they were fighting to catch up the Cardinals and just caught them in the last 2 games to win the NFC West, let alone get to the playoffs. So they've always kind of had to win. Whereas some of the other teams, and this is an example from Philadelphia, they might be going into the last 2 or 3 weeks of the season even thinking of resting players for the playoffs. So I always kind of feel that those stats were a little bit skewed. As for Wilson overall, of course, he's been very, very good this year because he's had to be. I mean, he's doing it all by himself. In the past, he's had at least the support of a top-notch, top-tier, loaded defense, and Marshawn Lynch, or Thomas Rawls as it was in 2015 before he got injured, and now he's the show. I mean, it's completely dependent on him. And one of the things I wrote on the blog recently, Kenny, was that in the past maybe the greatest pressure was coming from an opponent's defensive line, and it certainly was the case last year. But now the pressure is kind of coming from within. That pressure for him to do a little bit more. I think he's thrown 4 interceptions in his last 4 games, something like that. In the previous 7 games, he'd thrown 4 interceptions. Is he forcing things a little bit? Is he feeling like, is that early pick against San Francisco when he had an easy check down to J.D. McKissic? Is that him sort of feeling like, I must do more than I've had to do in previous years? And is that going to lead to a few more mistakes because he is throwing it more, because he is trying to force it a little bit more? And maybe that's why he's starting slowly. Maybe he comes out there kind of feeling, right, here we go, it's all on me. And they kind of get behind the 8 ball a little bit, and then in the second half he comes roaring back because that's what Russell Wilson does. That's what the Seahawks do. But I kind of feel like if the Seahawks were going to be a legit Super Bowl contender this year, they need to support this guy. Even Tom Brady last year, as good as Brady was, had I think 18 touchdowns, some LeGarrette Blount or something like that. You do need a compliment there. Matt Ryan was the MVP, had Devonta Freeman and Tevin Coleman and Julio Jones. Russ has got Graham, he's got Bowen, he's got Richardson, he's got Lockett, but he doesn't have any running backs that they can trust. And I kind of feel like his great season, or the best season of his career so far, statistically, might be wasted because they just couldn't get in the support.
And how do you feel, since we haven't talked since it happened, how have you felt in the Dwayne Brown era of the Seahawks, and the protection that Wilson is getting now? And what are your thoughts now that we're going into a Dwayne Brown, Luke Jokel, Justin Britt situation on that part of the offensive line, and some changes being made? Does it give you hope that the Seahawks offense from here forward will actually run in the way that people wanted it to run, at least in the terms of giving Russell Wilson enough time to do what he wants to do, even if they aren't the run blocking team that they want to be?
Yeah, I'm really encouraged by the offensive line. I think it's one of the things that is a real progress this year, and it's taken a lot of change and a bit more investment in terms of picks and in terms of paying money. But I think that they're finally there. This is what people wanted. They wanted a competent left tackle. They wanted maybe a bit more of a veteran presence. They didn't want just these younger guys that had been brought in on the cheap. They've completely revolutionized how they approach the offensive line with Jokel and with Dwayne Brown and with Ode Abushi when he was playing before his injury. So they've gone with a different approach. I like the look of this offensive line. To me, it's kind of in the mold that what made Oakland good last year was that they've spent a bit of money on some of the interior guys. They paid their center Ronnie Hudson. Seattle's paid Justin Britt. They paid big money on a big name guard. All right, Seattle's got Jokel. It's not quite the same as Oakland's left guard, but they still made that investment there. They've got an older left tackle, but one that can get the job done. And Seattle's got some youth and some potential with Ifedi and with Posick. So I know that people are kind of still feeling down about this, and it doesn't help. I don't think Twitter helps these situations, because I love the Brian Boldinger breakdowns that he does on Twitter. Really entertaining. Love the way that he breaks them down. Great, great to watch. But it's very easy to go into a game tape and pick out the 2 whiffs and highlight them and put them in a 30-second video and say, this is not good enough. It's a lot harder to sort of break down the however many plays where things kind of just work. And they don't work necessarily in an outstanding way that really jumps off the screen that looks great on Twitter. They just work because people are doing their jobs. And I think that is what Seattle are doing in pass protection. And I think that we've also seen, I know a lot of people want to point the finger at the O-line for the running game, but we've seen with Chris Carson, I think he was getting 4 yards a carry. People like Lacey and Rawls are kind of getting 2 yards a carry. That if you have a running back there who is doing the right job and reading it properly and hitting the hole with some authority and getting those extra yards, that you can be successful in this running scheme. And I think when Mike Davis came in against Atlanta before he got injured, you could see somebody who was having a similar amount of success. So I think that the line has got a lot of potential there. Russell Wilson's obviously benefiting from that. I think they just need a running back now who is healthy and that they trust and they want to feature. I think that's the next step. And just a final point on the O-line. I think that Luke Jokel, if he can stay healthy and if they believe that it can get him at a decent price, is well worth keeping. I like the look of that 5. And I think that Efedi and Posick can develop. And I think the other 3 have got enough about them to sort of think, if you start 2018 with that line healthy and with a bit more chemistry and development, that can actually maybe even be a strength for the Seahawks moving forward.
So, with that being said, if we come to the sort of last part of this show today, I want to, also acknowledge what you were saying about the running back job and the ways to fill that in next year. The Seahawks don't have a day 2 draft pick. We know that Eddie Lacy is going to be a free agent next year, if not sooner. And he's probably not going to be in the sort of plans at all. Thomas Rawls, how they decide to move forward with him. I believe he's a restricted free agent, but however they choose to move forward with him, clearly they're not doing it right now. They don't have a lot of interest in playing him at the moment, so it's hard for us to see him being around. And Chris Carson, if he comes back in December, is going to give us another idea of how convincing he is as a number 1 back. And even still, no matter what he would be able to do if he did come back, it's just another reminder of how fragile the position is and that he's already had a serious ankle injury at this point. And, I've even read that maybe the idea of him coming back at all this year is extremely optimistic and unlikely. So with that being said, it's not necessarily going to be Mike Davis or J.D. McKissick. Once again, we're in a position where the Seahawks seem to need to draft a running back. And as I've said, they'll have their first-round pick as of right now at least, but they've traded their second-round pick for Sheldon Richardson, and they traded their third-round pick for Dwayne Brown, which means that they would have to go into a trade situation or a day 3. Maybe they'll make up a day 4, but they'll have day 3 there to do all their needs. So in terms of the Seahawks' specific needs at the running back position and what they like from a running back and the 2018 draft class of running backs, what are you seeing, Rob?
I think it's the ideal year to think about drafting a running back early again. Every year we get to a point where the combine comes and goes, and we can kind of narrow down the list. We know what the Seahawks like from a running back. They've consistently drafted the same type of player. I mean, you can run through the list. I've got a post on the blog. If you go on there at the moment, there's a link to some articles about Damian Harris and Kerryon Johnson. If you go to the first Damian Harris link, then you will find sort of a breakdown of what they look for. And that's not necessarily the fastest guy. They can run in the 4.5s quite easily. That's what Chris Carson ran, a 4.58, for example. Christian Michael, a 4.54. So they're not looking for lightning speed. What they're looking for is explosive qualities. Great broad jump, great vertical jump. Bench press needs to be pretty good as well. And then you can kind of narrow it down to the list, and they like certain size. So, a ballpark kind of physical profile for a running back from Seattle based on what they've drafted is about 5'10", 5'11", and about 220 pounds, kind of in that range. And when you actually look at this group of running backs, there are players who definitely fit that bill. So Saquon Barkley is the obvious one, but he's going to be long gone. He's definitely going to go in the top 5. There's no chance of him falling. But then you have guys like Damian Harris, Kerryon Johnson that I mentioned there, Nick Chubb, Rashad Penny at San Diego State, Royce Freeman, not the hugest fan of his, but some interest there as well in terms of athleticism. I just wish he was a bit more physical. But the two that I kind of focus on are Damian Harris at Alabama and Kerryon Johnson at Auburn. These two players are incredibly underrated. I cannot believe how underrated they are. Damian Harris, for example, he's such a big. I think because he's not got the size of Bo Scarborough or kind of the intrigue of Derrick Henry, or the size of Derrick Henry, or the intrigue of a Trent Richardson or Mark Ingram, hasn't won any awards. I think you kind of forget just how explosive he has been. And I recently had a look at yards per carry by Alabama running backs, and the likes of Ingram was a 5.5 yards per carry guy, 6.1 yards. Trent Richardson in that 5-6 yards per carry. TJ Yeldon was, Derrick Henry was, Bo Scarborough's been at 4.5 yards a carry. And Damian Harris this year is running at over 8 yards a carry. He is a big play, chunk play, explosive play artist, and yet has got the tenacity, the physicality, the cutback ability. I've put videos on the blog of him blocking in pass protection, and he does it like his life depends on protecting that quarterback. He is just the most underrated player in college football. And I sincerely hope as a junior that he's going to declare for this draft and be available to the Seahawks, because he may come back for another year. He's not got too much tread on the tires. He's the kind of running back who does return, plays for a good team. Nick Saban can dangle the carrot of a Heisman campaign next year, which is within his grasp. He's going to get his yards at Alabama. And he's not ran nearly as many carries as Derrick Henry did, for example. So he's still got the tread there. So he may be persuaded to stay at Alabama. But if he turns pro, keep an eye on this guy, because he's good enough that I would consider taking him in round 1. If they want to trade down once, twice, Kenny, get into round 2, and they feel they can get him there, then be my guest and go and recapture some of those picks that you gave up for Sheldon and for Dwayne Brown. But Damian Harris is such a fantastic player, and Kerryon Johnson at Auburn. I don't know if anybody's seen Auburn are the most fun team to watch in college football this year, and they've kind of got a swagger to them. It's a little bit like the 2013 Seahawks. Terrific, tough defense. They run the heck out of the ball with Kerryon. He actually hurt his shoulder in the Alabama game last week, after having dominated the game, by the way, and practically won it for Auburn. But it looks as if he's going to fight through the pain to play against Georgia in the SEC championship this weekend, which is going to be such an interesting game to watch, because Auburn absolutely, shellacked Georgia a couple of weeks ago when they played in the conference game. So Kerryon Johnson's a bit more like Chris Carson, kind of long-legged, but so tough to bring down. Like, really just finishes every run. Incredible athlete, was recruited as an athlete, was going to play safety, then got converted to running back. And he's just the most incredible player. I put a video up over the weekend of his pass protection. I've put it on again the blog today, of what he does in pass protection. And, maybe not quite as physical and tenacious as Damian Harris, but does a good job there. That's usually the thing that keeps a running back off the field as a rookie. And the character of both players, so personable, great interviews, really, really humble guys, but just play with an edge. And for me, if the Seahawks are looking for a running back next year, they would be the first 2 names that I look at after Saquon Barkley. Is Damian Harris at Alabama, Kerryon Johnson at Auburn. Watch these guys. Watch them when you get an opportunity. Auburn are playing Georgia again this weekend. It's a chance to watch Nick Chubb as well. Stick that game on. Watch the SEC Championship. Watch 2 really good running backs. Sony Michel's in that game as well. And if Alabama sneak into the playoffs as well, see if you can watch Damian Harris, because these are the players that, for me, the Seahawks need, and they're the most exciting ones I've seen so far. I stand to change that opinion because it's only November the 30th today, but at the moment, they're the 2 that I think are just so exciting and would be a great fit for the Seahawks.
Well, Whoop, there it is. We'll be looking out for those running backs, of course, for the next few weeks and months, and we'll see what happens with the Seahawks and their running back situation. And of course, Carson can return, but obviously they'll still need to add help at the position next year. Rob, as we head out in the podcast, I always sort of give you an opportunity to say your last words, and I think the best, perhaps, last words to end out on is just, with the big game this weekend, Seahawks Eagles at home. The Seahawks, if they lose this game, their season's far from over. But if they win the game, I think it sort of solidifies that they will be a playoffs team again. It's sort of a convincing win, and it helps them keep pace with the opportunity to take first place the following maybe 2 weeks later against the Rams. They have to go to Jacksonville, which that game has been moved from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. But Rob, what are your sort of thoughts? What are your expectations for this Sunday night's game against the Eagles as we head out?
Well, my hope and my expectation is that, for 2 things. One, that the Seahawks have enough pride and enough care about this thing that they will absolutely do their utmost to make sure that this team does not lose a 3rd game in a row at home. Because CenturyLink is supposed to be the toughest place to play in football, and they have to protect that reputation in this game. They cannot afford to lose to a 3rd team in a row on their own patch, and it's unthinkable that would happen. So they have to defend that. And the other thing, I'm sick to death of watching this Eagles team dancing on the field after they make big plays. I kind of had half an eye on the Eagles-Bears game at the weekend, and they had a routine defensive stop in a blowout victory in the fourth quarter, and they choreographed a team version of the electric slide. I have no idea why they tried to bring the electric slide back to the public domain, but they did, and they did it twice. And then after the game, you may well have seen this picture on the internet as well. There was a picture of the offensive line, Carson Wentz, Zach Ertz, and a couple of the running backs all posing for like a group selfie after the game. And then there was more dancing and more selfies and more dancing. And if I was the Chicago Bears, I would have come off that field and I would have stood in that locker room and said, that is the last time a team dances and photographs themselves and act like a bunch of teenagers after playing our team. And I hope the Seahawks notice that. And if I see the Eagles doing the electric slide at CenturyLink this weekend, I'm going to wake up that hotel in Kent. They are going to hear about it. It's time to end this. I don't mind the celebrations in the NFL, but the electric slide after a routine defensive stop in a blowout victory in a game against a team that's going to pick in the top 10 next year, no more. So the Seahawks have to win this game for the sole purpose to give the Eagles a kick up the backside and say enough is enough. No more dancing, no more pictures. And that's my final thought on the game. So that's why I hope, more than anything, forget the playoffs, forget CenturyLink. I just don't want any more dancing from the Eagles.
You heard it here first. No dancing by the Eagles in Seattle. This is Rob Staton's footloose rule of the weekend. And I think that's a perfect note to end out on. I am picking the Seahawks. So this has been Seahawks Chats with Kenneth Arthur / 3000 NFL mock draft with Rob Staton. And this has been a talk about the Seahawks this for coming year. I mean, past and present and future. We have talked about the Seahawks. You can't deny that. Follow Rob on Twitter at Rob Staton. Go to SeahawksDraftBlog.com for his work. You can also go to FieldGoals.com for the work of myself and my excellent staff of writers and videographers and such and whatnot. And this has been Seahawks Chats, or you can find us on the podcast world as Seaside Chats with Kenneth Arthur. When I talk to comedians, this week I talked to Johnny Schwarzbein and his love of the Eagles, and we debated who the best team in the NFC really is. So check that out as well. And we will come back next week, 8-4 for Seattle. But if not, we'll keep on chugging through. This has been a show.